The chamber of the Galactic Council was the most impressive structure in the known universe. It floated in the dead center of neutral space, between 17 star systems, built from materials that no single species could produce alone. Its walls were made of compressed starlight, its floors carved from the bones of dead planets, and its ceiling opened to a dome of pure crystal that showed every corner of the galaxy at once. 512 species had a seat in this chamber. They had argued, traded, negotiated, and occasionally threatened each other inside these walls for over 4,000 years. Nothing had ever truly surprised them. Until the humans asked for a seat dot, the request came through standard diplomatic channels, delivered by a small automated probe that drifted into council space with the confidence of something that had no idea how insignificant it was. The probe carried a simple message. Humanity had discovered faster-than-light travel. Humanity had colonized 11 star systems. Humanity wished to join the Galactic Council. The message was signed by something called the United Earth Government, stamped with an image of a blue planet wrapped in white clouds, and ended with the words, "We come in peace, but we are prepared for whatever comes next." The council had laughed. Not all of them, of course. The Velthari, a species of tall, silver-skinned diplomats who had been running the council for the last 800 years, did not laugh. They simply filed the request and assigned it a processing number. The processing number was 4,267,009. That was how many requests were currently waiting. At the council's average speed, humanity's request would be reviewed in approximately 600 years. But then something unexpected happened. Humanity did not wait. 3 months after sending the probe, a human vessel appeared in council space. It was not a warship. It was not a colony ship. It was a single diplomatic cruiser, painted white with the blue planet symbol on its side, and a crew of 40. The ship hailed the council station and politely requested a meeting. The Velthari, mildly irritated, told them to wait. The humans said they would wait, and they did. For 11 days, the human ship sat in neutral space without moving, without making demands, without doing anything at all, except occasionally transmitting music into open frequencies. The council species noticed the music first. It was strange. It was unlike anything they had heard before, a mixture of deep rhythm and layered melody that made no logical sense, but somehow felt like it meant something. Several species requested translations. The humans provided them. The songs were about longing, about distance, about things left behind and things hoped for. The Drenathi, a species that communicated entirely through sound, became so fascinated that they sent a small observation vessel just to listen more closely. On the 12th day, the Velthari called the humans in for a preliminary meeting, mostly to get the ship to stop broadcasting. The human ambassador was a woman named Commander Siren Voss. She was not what the council expected. Most species sent their most impressive physical specimens to diplomatic meetings. The craft sent warriors 7 feet tall with 4 arms. The Pelori sent beings that glowed with bioluminescent light. Siren Voss was of average height, had short dark hair, and wore a simple gray uniform with no decorations, except for a small metal pin on her collar shaped like the Earth. She walked into the chamber of the Galactic Council, looked at 512 alien species staring down at her from their raised seats, and did not flinch. She introduced herself. She introduced her planet. She gave a brief history of humanity in 12 minutes, touching on their wars, their recoveries, their technology, and their expansion. She did not apologize for the wars. She did not pretend they had not happened. She simply stated them as facts, the way someone might describe weather patterns. The council was unsettled by this. Most species, when presenting themselves for membership, spent the majority of their introduction assuring the council that they were peaceful and posed no threat. Siren Voss did not say that. She said humanity was capable of peace. She said humanity preferred peace. But she did not say they were defenseless. The Velthari High Speaker, a being named Ethsalaron, leaned forward from his elevated seat and asked the question that everyone was thinking. Commander Voss, humanity has had faster-than-light travel for less than 30 of your years. You have colonized 11 systems. You are a very young species. What exactly do you believe you can offer the Galactic Council? Siren Voss looked up at him without hesitation. Loyalty, she said. Innovation. And if it ever becomes necessary, protection. The chamber went quiet. To Ethsalaron tilted his head. His species did not smile, but the gesture he made with his secondary hands conveyed something close to amusement. Protection, he repeated slowly. You believe a species 30 years into interstellar travel can offer protection to a council that has stood for 4,000 years. I believe, Siren said, that in 4,000 years, no one in this room has ever faced anything like what we went through to get here. And I believe that matters. The council did not accept humanity's application that day. They assigned it a new processing number, 312. That was a significant jump. It meant the Velthari had moved them up the list. Not because they were impressed, because they were curious. What no one in that chamber knew, what no sensor array in council space had yet detected, was what was sitting on the other side of the nearest transit point, 17 light minutes away from the station. It was not a diplomatic cruiser. It was not 40 people. It was a fleet, 108 warships, each one carrying 800 soldiers, fully armed, fully briefed, and waiting for a single encrypted signal from Commander Siren Voss. The signal would mean one of two things. Either she had been harmed, and they were to respond with everything they had, or she was fine, and they were to remain exactly where they were. Siren had not told the council about the fleet. She had not lied about it either. She had simply not mentioned it. In her report to the Earth government before leaving, she had written one line about this decision. If they ask, I will tell them. If they don't ask, they weren't paying attention. Outside the crystal dome, the galaxy turned slowly in every direction. Stars burned at distances that made even the oldest council members feel small when they allowed themselves to think about it. Somewhere in that darkness, humanity was 30 years into a journey that every other species had taken thousands of years to make. And unlike every other species, they had not arrived alone. They had arrived ready. The council would spend the next 3 weeks reviewing humanity's application. They would interview Siren Voss 4 more times. They would send probes to human space to verify the colonization claims. The probes would return with data that was significantly more impressive than anyone had predicted. 11 colonies, yes, but also 17 active research stations, a shipyard producing vessels at a rate no young species had ever matched, and a military infrastructure that, when the analysts ran the numbers twice, because the first result seemed impossible, was ranked in the top 12% of all council member species. The analysts ran the numbers a third time. The result was the same dot the Velthari called an emergency closed session. Only the senior representatives of the 7 founding species were allowed inside. The door sealed. For 6 hours, nothing came out. When Ethsalaron finally emerged, he looked at the aide waiting outside and said 3 words that had never been spoken about a new species in 4,000 years of council history. Review the defenses. His aide stared at him. Sir, the station defenses? Ethsalaron said again, his voice very calm, very measured, and very quiet. Review them. All of them. Tonight. Down in the guest quarters of the station, Siren Voss was eating a meal she had brought from home, reading a report on her datapad, and listening to music through a small earpiece. She had not sent the signal to the fleet. Everything was fine. She was not worried. She had done exactly what she came to do. She had shown them who humanity was. She had been honest. She had been direct. She had not begged or performed or pretended. And now, for the first time in 4,000 years, the Galactic Council was paying very close attention to something small and new and entirely unexpected. Siren turned a page on her datapad and smiled to herself. The real conversation, she knew, was just beginning. The Velthri did not sleep. As a species, they had not needed sleep in over 2,000 years, a biological evolution that they considered one of their greatest advantages in running the Council. They could think without interruption, plan without exhaustion, and observe without the clouding effect of dreams. But in the 3 weeks following Siren Voss's arrival, several senior Velthri representatives found themselves doing something they had not done in centuries. They sat still. They stared at nothing. Their secondary hands, which normally moved in constant small gestures reflecting ongoing thought, went quiet. The human analysts watching them through the guest observation feeds noted this and sent a report back to Earth. The report had one line: "We have their attention." The probe data from human space arrived in full on the 16th day. The Council's lead intelligence analyst, a Pelori named Sorisvel, who had spent 300 years cataloging new species, sat in her office for 4 hours without moving after reviewing the files. Her assistant, a young craft trainee, eventually came to check on her and found her still staring at the same screen. "Are you well?" the trainee asked. Sorisvel turned to look at him and said, very slowly, "Go find the last 10 species that applied for Council membership and pull their military assessments at the time of application." The trainee did so. He returned in 20 minutes with 10 files. Sorisvel compared them to humanity's file for exactly 6 minutes, then closed everything and walked directly to 8th Solaron's office without an appointment, which was something no one had done in living memory. What she showed him was not the raw numbers. Numbers could be misread, miscontextualized, explained away. What she showed him was a progression chart. She had taken every species that had ever joined the Council and plotted their military capability against the number of years they had been in interstellar space when they applied. The chart covered 4,000 years of data and 490 species. The line was predictable. Young species were weak. As they aged and expanded, they grew stronger. It was a smooth curve, rising gently over centuries. Every single species sat within a small margin of that curve. Every single one, except one. One data point sat so far above the curve that when she had first generated the chart, she thought the program had made an error. She had checked it 11 times. It had not made an error. Humanity, 30 years into interstellar space, was performing at a level that the chart predicted no species should reach for at least 800 more years. ETH Solaron looked at the chart for a long time. Then he asked the question that was the only logical question to ask. How? Sorisvel had spent the last 4 hours trying to answer that. She had a theory. It was uncomfortable, and she did not like it, but it was the only thing that fit the data. They had a head start, she said. Not in space. On the ground. Whatever they went through on their home planet, whatever their history involved, it compressed development in a way we have never seen. They did not arrive in space as a young species learning to be dangerous. They arrived already knowing how. This was the truth about humanity that the Council had not been prepared to receive. Every species that had ever joined was understood. Not completely, not perfectly, but in broad strokes. You could look at a species' biology, their home environment, their early history, and predict more or less what kind of interstellar civilization they would become. A species from a calm, resource-rich planet tended to be explorers. A species from a harsh, competitive environment tended to be aggressive, but also highly adaptive. A species that had faced extinction and survived tended to be cautious and heavily defense-minded. Humanity did not fit cleanly into any category. They were simultaneously explorers and warriors, cautious and aggressive, peaceful and prepared. They had fought wars that should have ended their species, and instead come out building faster ships. They had faced catastrophe repeatedly, and each time had rebuilt not just what was lost, but something better. And they had done all of this in such a short window of time that the Council's models simply could not account for it. On the 18th day, Siren Voss was called in for her third interview. The panel this time was different. The first two interviews had been handled by junior Velthari administrators, following standard procedures. This time, 7 senior representatives were present, including F. Salaron himself. Siren sat down across from them, noted the change, and said nothing about it. She waited. E. Salaron spoke first. He placed the progression chart on the table between them and let her look at it. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Siren studied it for a moment. "A capability chart," she said, "comparing species at time of application." Salaron nodded. "Can you find your species on it?" She looked for a moment, then pointed to the outlier above the curve. She did not seem surprised. "We're aware that we developed quickly," she said. Salaron leaned forward slightly. "Commander Voss, you are not just above the curve. You are so far above it that we had to check our instruments. Can you explain this?" Siren looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that no diplomat from any species had ever said in this chamber before. "With respect, High Speaker, I think you already know the explanation. You just don't want it to be true." The room went very still. Siren continued, keeping her voice level and her tone respectful. "Every species in this council developed in relative safety. You had time. You had room to grow slowly, to make mistakes, to recover. We did not have that luxury. We made every mistake at full speed, at maximum consequence, with no safety net and no one to help us. We nearly destroyed ourselves 7 times before we ever left our planet. And every time we came back harder. Not angrier, not more violent, harder, more capable, more efficient. What looks like rapid development to you is just what happens when you have no choice but to get it right or disappear." One of the other representatives, a Kraf elder named Var Seeken, spoke up. His voice was low and rough, the sound of someone who had fought his own wars before rising to diplomacy. "And your military? Your fleet? You brought a fleet here, to a diplomatic meeting." Siren met his eyes. "We brought a defensive perimeter," she said. "Every human vessel that leaves home space travels with one. We do not go anywhere unprepared. That is not aggression. That is how we survived long enough to be sitting in this room." Var Seeken studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he made a gesture with his 4 hands that was the Kraf equivalent of a nod. It was the first moment of genuine respect the panel had shown. What the panel did not show, what they kept carefully off their faces and out of their body language, was fear. Not fear of humanity as an enemy, not fear of being attacked, but a deeper, more unsettling kind of fear that came from looking at something and realizing you had badly miscalculated it. The Council had spent 4,000 years curating the galaxy's civilizations. They knew how new species behaved. They knew the patterns, the predictable arcs of development, the typical mistakes, and the typical recoveries. They had systems for everything. They had procedures, timelines, processing numbers. And into all of that, humanity had walked with its 30 years of interstellar history and its 108 warships and its ambassador who spoke about near extinction, the way other species talked about weather. And none of the systems had caught it. None of the procedures had flagged it. The probe had been filed under processing number 4 million and change, and it had taken a music broadcast to even get humanity into the room. That night, Solaron sent a private message to all 7 founding species. It was encrypted at the highest level and contained only one attachment, the progression chart and a single question. If humanity continues on this trajectory for 500 years, what does the chart show? Every recipient ran the projection independently. Every projection came back with the same answer. In 500 years, humanity would not be in the top 12% of Council military capability. They would be at the top, alone, by a distance that made every other species look like the ones who had just sent their first probe into space. Siren Voss, back in her quarters, had just received a private encrypted message from Earth. It was from the Joint Defense Council, and it contained updated intelligence on 6 frontier systems where human colonies had reported unusual probe activity from unknown vessels in recent weeks. Someone had been watching human space. Someone who had not identified themselves. She read the report twice, then sent a brief reply. I'm aware. Continue monitoring. Do not engage. I'll handle it from this end. She set down the datapad, looked out the viewport at the crystal dome and the stars beyond it, and thought about what she had said to Solaron. They already knew. They just didn't want it to be true. She was becoming increasingly certain that the unknown probes and the Council's sudden intense interest were not 2 separate problems. They were the same problem, and it was about to get significantly more complicated. The emergency session was called without warning on the 22nd day. Siren Voss was not invited. She found out about it the same way she found out about most things on the station, through careful observation. A reliable instinct for when the energy in a room shifted, and a signals analyst back on Earth named Daco, who had been quietly monitoring every frequency in Council space since the diplomatic cruiser arrived. Daco sent her a short message at 0300 station time. Big meeting. All founding species. No staff, no record. Something happened. Siren got up, dressed, and went to stand at the viewport in her quarters, where she could see the east wing of the station directly below the crystal dome. Every light in the founding wing was on. What had happened was this. At 0217 station time, a vessel had dropped out of transit in Council space without identification, without clearance, and without any signal of any kind. It had sat at the edge of the monitored zone for exactly 4 minutes, then vanished back into transit. Council defense systems had tracked it. The vessel's profile did not match any registered species. It was not in any database. It was not even close to any known configuration. But what the defense systems had captured in those 4 minutes was a detailed scan of the station and everything around it. And when the Council's intelligence team ran the scan data, they found something that turned a routine anomaly into an emergency. The unknown vessel had been looking for something specific. It had scanned the station itself only briefly. The majority of its scanning time had been directed at the human diplomatic cruiser sitting in the guest berth, and at the transit corridor, 17 light minutes out where the human fleet was still waiting. Someone knew the fleet was there. Someone who was not in the Council. Someone who was very interested in what humanity had brought to this station and very careful not to be identified while looking at it. ETH Solaron opened the emergency session by placing the scan data on the table and saying nothing for 30 seconds, which was his way of letting the information absorb before anyone spoke. The 6 other founding species representatives looked at the data with varying degrees of alarm. The Pelori representative, Arya Sunal, was the first to speak. She said what everyone was thinking. They were counting the fleet. Solaron nodded. Vyar Seekin of the Krath looked at the scan pattern in silence for a moment, then said they knew it was there. They did not find it by accident. Someone told them. This landed in the room like something heavy dropped on a hard floor. Everyone felt it. No one immediately argued with it. The question of who had provided information about the human fleet's position to an unidentified vessel led immediately to a second, much more uncomfortable question. How many unidentified vessels were currently operating in or near Council space? And why had the Council's defense network not flagged any of them before now? Ethsalaran pulled the defense logs for the previous 6 months. His hands moved very slowly as he reviewed them. He found 4 instances of brief, unidentified contacts that had been logged as sensor anomalies and not investigated further. 4 times in 6 months. And the pattern of those 4 contacts, when plotted on a star map, formed a surveillance perimeter around Council space that any military analyst would recognize immediately. Someone had been watching the Council for half a year, and they had started, or at least significantly increased their activity, at almost exactly the time humanity sent its first probe. When Siren Voss was summoned to the session 2 hours later, she did not look surprised. She walked in, sat down at the table across from 7 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and waited. Salaran showed her the scan data. He showed her the defense logs. He showed her the perimeter map. He asked her if she knew what this was. Siren looked at everything carefully. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and placed her own datapad on the table, already open to a file. My government received its first report of unusual probe activity in frontier space 43 days ago, she said. I received an updated report 3 days ago. 6 frontier systems. Unidentified vessels. Same profile as what you're showing me. Ethsalaran stared at her datapad. Arya Sunal leaned forward. Vior Seekin made a sound that translated roughly as deep concern. You knew, Ethsalaran said carefully. Before you came here, you knew someone was watching your space. Siren met his eyes. We suspected. We did not have enough data to confirm. We do now. There was a pause. Ethsalaran's secondary hands began moving in rapid, complex patterns. And your fleet, he said slowly. Was it sent here to impress the Council, or was it sent here because you anticipated a threat? Siren did not answer immediately. She let the silence sit for exactly the right amount of time, not long enough to seem evasive, just long enough to be honest. Both, she said. We do not separate those things. The session continued for 4 more hours. By the end of it, several things had changed in the Council chamber that had not changed in 4,000 years. For the first time in the Council's history, a species that had not yet been granted membership was invited to participate in a founding species security briefing. For the first time, human military intelligence data was entered directly into the Council's shared security database. And for the first time, Vior Seekin of the Kroth, who had fought wars before most species in the Council, had developed writing, looked across a table at a human ambassador and said something he had never said to a non-member species. Tell your fleet to move closer. Outside. Across 17 light minutes of space, the human fleet received the encrypted signal from Commander Voss, not the emergency signal. A different one. A signal that had been prepared but never used before. One that Siren had designed herself before leaving Earth, knowing she might need it. The signal had one word attached to it, a word she had chosen carefully. The word was forward. All 108 warships began to move, the species watching from the station's observation. Port saw the fleet arrive over the next several hours. It came out of transit in formation, precise and unhurried, each vessel finding its position and holding it without any visible communication being necessary. The Council's analysts, watching the formation, noted several things simultaneously. The ships were well built. The formation was tactically sophisticated, covering all approach angles without clustering. Every vessel maintained exact spacing, which meant either exceptional training or exceptional automated systems. And given what they knew about humanity, it was probably both. And there were more ships than the original count. When the final vessel dropped out of transit and the fleet was fully assembled, the count was not 108. It was 131. 23 additional vessels had been waiting at a second position that the Council's sensors had not located. Sor Isvel, watching the formation from the intelligence office, quietly updated her assessment files. She did not change the numbers. She just added one line at the bottom. They told us 108. They had 131. This was not deception. This was testing. They wanted to see if we would find the others. We did not. She saved the file and sat for a moment looking at that last sentence. Then she added one more line. We should have. Siren Voss stood at the observation port in the diplomatic wing and watched her fleet take position around the council station. She felt something she had not let herself feel since leaving Earth. A deep, steady warmth that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with trust. Those were her people out there. Every ship, every crew, every soldier had come here because they had been asked to come, because they understood that sometimes showing up was the most powerful thing you could do. They had not fired a single weapon. They had not threatened anyone. They had simply arrived, and their arrival had changed the shape of everything. In the council chamber, the founding species representatives were very quiet. Not the quiet of confidence. The quiet of people who were carefully revising something they thought they already understood. Ethsalaran stood at the window looking at the fleet and thought about the progression chart and the 500-year projection and the unknown vessels watching from the edges of known space. He thought about a species that had almost destroyed itself 7 times and kept coming back stronger. He thought about an ambassador who had walked into this chamber alone and been neither afraid nor aggressive, just present, just honest, just ready. And he thought about one thing above all else, the thing that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the first day, and which he now could no longer keep there. The unknown vessels had not started watching council space when the probe arrived. They had started watching exactly 47 days before that. 3 days before humanity had ever sent anything at all. Someone had known humanity was coming before humanity announced it. And that meant this situation was not about membership. It was not about diplomacy. It was about something that had been set in motion before any of them had even begun to understand the pieces. The answer came from a direction no one had anticipated. Not from the Council's intelligence teams, who had been working through the night, running cross-references on the unidentified vessel profiles. Not from the human fleet's long-range sensors, though they had been actively scanning the surrounding space since arriving in formation. It came from a small, old, almost forgotten file in the Council's deepest archives, retrieved by a junior Velthari researcher named Selmaran, who had been assigned the tedious task of comparing the unknown vessel design to historical records going back to the Council's founding. Selmaran found the match at 3 in the morning, stared at it for 10 full minutes to make sure he was not misreading what he was seeing, then walked straight to Ethsalaran's office and stood outside the door until it opened. The vessel profile matched a species called the Vorith. This was not a name that appeared anywhere in current Council records because the Vorith had been formally declared extinct 900 years ago. According to the historical files, they had been a founding-era species, present at the formation of the Council itself, before withdrawing from participation in the Council's 3rd century, and eventually disappearing entirely, after a series of internal conflicts that the records described only vaguely. The last official Vorith contact had been 892 years ago. Their space had been formally opened for settlement 200 years after that, when no contact had been made for nearly 7 centuries. Several council species now had colonies in what had been Vorith territory, or what everyone had believed had been Vorith territory. E.T. Solaron read the file 3 times. He pulled the old star maps. He compared them to the current patrol routes and the perimeter pattern of the unidentified contacts. The match was not approximate. It was exact. Every single unidentified contact in the last 6 months had originated from within former Vorith space, from systems that the Council had classified as uninhabited for centuries. And the timing, the fact that the surveillance had begun before humanity's probe, before any public record of human faster-than-light development, pointed to something that required Eth-Solaron to sit down, which he rarely did, and take a long, slow breath before continuing. The Vorith had not gone extinct. They had gone quiet, and they had been watching, not just the Council, but specifically the edges of the galaxy where new species were emerging, waiting for something. The question that burned through every piece of logic Eth-Solaron could apply was, what had they been waiting for? And why had humanity's emergence been the trigger that brought them to the edge of Council space after 9 centuries of silence? He called Siren Voss at 0530 and told her everything. Siren listened without interruption. When Eth-Solaron finished, she was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she asked the only question that mattered in that moment. How powerful are they? Solaron said, "We do not know. Our records from their active period show a species that was considered among the strongest of the founding era. But that was 900 years ago. 900 years of unknown development. We cannot assess them." Siren said, "Then we assume the worst and prepare accordingly." Solaron paused for just a moment, then said, "Yes, I believe that is correct." It was the first time in the conversation he had agreed with her without qualification. It would not be the last. The full council session that morning was unlike anything in 4,000 years of history. Siren Voss sat not in the guest area, but at the table with the founding species representatives by Eth-Solaron's direct invitation, a breach of procedure so significant that 2 council administrative staff actually walked out in protest. She sat next to Veor Seekin, who had spent the previous night reviewing old Croth military records about the founding era species and arrived with a thick file of his own. He slid a page to Siren as she sat down. It was a Krath tactical assessment from 800 years ago, describing a Vorith fleet action. Siren read it quickly. The numbers in the old report were significant. She passed the page back and said, low enough that only he could hear, "Good to know." Veor Seekin's 4 hands were very still, which in Krath meant something between respect and readiness. Eth-Solaron presented the Vorith finding to the full council. The reaction was not what an outside observer might have expected. There was no panic. There was no shouting. What there was the particular kind of silence that spreads through a group of experienced beings when something they thought was safely in the past suddenly turns out to be very much in the present. Several representatives left the chamber to make private communications. Several others pulled up historical files. The Drenathi representative produced a sound that no one had heard from them before, low and resonant, which the translation system rendered simply as ancient danger. While the council absorbed the Vorith revelation, Siren's signals analyst Dako, still running his quiet monitoring operation from Earth, detected something new. 3 new contacts, same profile as before, but this time not at the edge of council space. Inside it, moving, not on any registered transit lane. Moving in a pattern that Dako recognized after staring at it for 40 seconds. Because he had played enough strategy games and run enough simulations to know what encirclement looked like when it was just beginning. He sent Siren the data marked urgent. She read it during a brief recess and walked back into the chamber, went directly to Eth-Solaron, and quietly placed her datapad on the table in front of him. He looked at the contact pattern. His secondary hands went completely still. "They are already inside," Siren said. Eth-Salaran looked at the data for another 2 seconds. "Yes," she said. "We have 3 options. We can wait and let them make the first move. We can broadcast a general signal, acknowledging we know they are there, and request contact. Or we can deploy the fleet into a counter-encirclement pattern and make very clear that we see them and we are not impressed." Eth-Salaran looked at her. She looked back. He said very quietly, "Option 3 is a significant escalation." Siren said, "Option 1 is surrender." He said nothing for a moment. Then, Option 3. The human fleet moved. It moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that comes not from programming, but from training. From crews that had run these patterns in simulation hundreds of times, and in live drills, enough times that the movements were reflexive. Within 40 minutes, the fleet had repositioned from its station guarding formation into a wide, overlapping network that covered every approach angle the Vorath contacts were using. Not aggressively, not in an attack posture, but perfectly, unmistakably positioned to respond to anything that moved. The Council's defense analysts, watching the repositioning, ran the coverage calculation and then ran it again. The human fleet, 131 ships, had achieved a defensive coverage that should have required at least 3 times that number, according to standard Council doctrine. The Vorath contacts stopped moving. For 6 hours, nothing happened. The Council station was very quiet. The human fleet held its position without drift, without variance, without any sign that the crews inside those ships were tired or uncertain or anything other than completely ready. The Vorath contacts sat still inside their positions, watching. Salaran sat at the head of the council table and watched everything on the display screens and thought about 900 years of silence ending in this moment, in this chamber, because a species 30 years into space had walked in uninvited and changed every calculation simply by being exactly what they were. The signal came at hour 7. A tight beam transmission, precisely directed at the Council station and at the human fleet flagship simultaneously. It was in old Vorath code, which the Council's archives contained. A translation took 11 minutes. When it came through, Eth-Salaran read it twice and passed it to Siren. She read it once. The message was long, but its meaning was simple. The Vorath had withdrawn from the Council 9 centuries ago, not because they had lost a conflict, but because they had predicted one. They had spent those centuries watching, waiting for the emergence of a species that matched a very specific profile in their predictive models. A species that developed dangerously fast. A species with a history of near extinction and recovery. A species that arrived not alone but armed, not aggressive but unafraid. In their models, such a species, if integrated into the Council structure, would either stabilize the entire galactic order or trigger a war unlike anything the galaxy had seen. They had come to determine which. Siren set the message down. The room was watching her. She looked at Eth-Salaran and said, "They were watching us to decide if we were an asset or a threat." Eth-Salaran said, "Yes, and we did not detect them for 9 centuries. Siren said, "But we moved first." He nodded slowly. "You moved first." She looked back at the message for a moment. Then she looked at the display showing the fleet, holding perfectly still in its impossible coverage formation. And she thought about every species that had told humanity to slow down, to wait, to process through the proper channels, to take a number and come back in 600 years. She thought about 7 near extinctions and 7 recoveries and 30 years that had somehow compressed 8 centuries of development. She thought about the music her ship had broadcast for 11 days, about longing and D,